Welcome to this special edition of the Gospel in 3D. This video series exists to equip and encourage every Christian to live every day with gospel intentionality. My name is Derek Van Ruler. You know, in the Christian world, it's like there are two Super Bowls, if you will, Christmas and Easter. 2 days that are marked off from the rest of the year that are incredibly important for the Christian faith. Christmas is the coming of our Savior into the world that He created in order to save those who have rejected Him. And Easter is the day He rose from the dead, conquering sin, Satan, and death. And yet far too often what I find is that we rush into both of these events, getting caught up in the commercialization of them while neglecting to think about our own heart in the midst of it. We find ourselves busy running from here and there, and yet we have no time to prepare our hearts to really understand the gravity of what God is doing here. And I want to help you with that this year. So what I want to do is to briefly walk you through the final week leading up to that wonderful Easter morning. And so 7 days before Jesus is found to have risen from the dead, we celebrate what is known as Palm Sunday. We read of that day in Matthew 21, verses 1 to 11, where Jesus rides into town on a donkey and people are praising Him as the glorious Messiah who has come to rescue them from their turmoil and their trouble. We see so much expectation and joy as He enters the community. And yet just 5 days later, they will have Him crucified. The next day, which is called Holy Monday, we read in Matthew 21, 12 to 17 and Mark 11, 12 to 14 that Jesus enters Jerusalem, and as He does, He curses a fig tree for not producing fruit. That's a sign of what will come. Because as Jesus enters Jerusalem, He finds the center of Jewish worship. The temple has been turned from a place to worship God to a place of worshipful greed. They've taken what was religious and turned it into a profit for themselves. And so Jesus turns over tables and calls them out for their greed. And as they leave the city, they notice this fig tree that was cursed has withered, just like the temple religion. It's dead. Next, we have Holy Tuesday. Unfortunately, not much is known about Holy Tuesday. There are things that we can imagine that would have happened, but nothing that we know for sure took place on this day. Then we have what is known as Spy Wednesday. From Matthew 26, 14 to 16 and Mark 14, 10 to 11, we note how Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples, conspire with their religious leaders to hand Jesus over to His death, all for 30 pieces of silver. But the steps are now in place, much to the rest of the disciples' soon dismay. Their master will be handed over and killed the following night. The next day we see as the plot begins to thicken as we reach what is called Maundy Thursday. Matthew 26, 17 to 56 shows us that this is the moment that Jesus celebrates the ancient festival known as Passover. Passover was the festival in which Jews would come to Jerusalem and celebrate how about 1,400 years before they were enslaved in Egypt. And God, through Moses, led the people out of Egypt by sending an angel of death to kill the firstborn. And that angel of death passed over the Israelite houses because they had the lamb's blood spread across their door jambs. And so now, 1,400 years later, they're celebrating this occasion together. And we read here how Jesus takes this festival and transforms it into what we now call the Last Supper with His 12 disciples, where He institutes the ordinance of communion. He takes the bread and the cup of wine, and together He says, "This is my body that will be broken for you, and this is my blood that will be shed for you in a matter of 24 short hours." As they take this meal together, Judas runs out of the house, preparing to go and betray Jesus into the hands of the enemy. Well, as time goes on, Jesus leaves that house knowing what is going to happen and goes and prays. And as he does, he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane and he pleads with his Father to let the cup of wrath pass from him. But not his will be done, but God's will be done. As he finishes his time praying, Judas, with a band of people, come and have Jesus arrested. This is where the overzealous Peter chops off the ear of one of the soldiers, but Jesus graciously heals the man. From here we see Jesus taken away and delivered over to Pilate to be condemned to death. Evening turns into night, and night turns into morning. Good Friday, to be exact. And in the wee hours of the morning, we see Jesus on trial before the high priest, who questions him about his teaching. And when he has seen enough, he delivers him over to Pilate, the governor, to be tried in the Roman courts. At this point, Pilate begins to realize there's nothing wrong with Jesus, and that Jesus is actually under Herod's jurisdiction. So he sends Jesus to Herod for Herod to deal with him. But Herod simply mocks Jesus and sends him back to Pilate. In Pilate's hands now, he asks the crowd what to do with Jesus. And they shout, "Crucify him." Fearing the crowd, Pilate grants them their wish and releases Barabbas, the murderer, and has Jesus sentenced to his death on a cross. Now, this death was incredibly gruesome. Most scholars believe that he was beaten 39 times with a rope that had balls with spikes in them, tearing open his back. They had a nail spike driven into his wrists and into his ankles so that he could hang there. And then they rose him up from the ground for all to see and to mock him. And as he hung there, in order to breathe, he would have had to use all of his energy to press on those spikes to inhale and exhale, eventually suffocating on his own blood. And about 3 p.m, Jesus died, and the curtain of the temple, blocking the Holy of Holies, was torn down as a way to say that access to God was opened up. Then that afternoon, a man by the name of Joseph gathered his body and placed him into the tomb and rolled a large stone to block the entrance of the tomb. The next day, Holy Saturday, the religious elite remembered Jesus' claim that he would die and rise from the dead. And so in order to combat his claim, we read in Matthew 27 that they convinced Pilate to set a guard at the entrance of the tomb so that no one could steal his body and say that he was alive. But that did not stop the power of God. Because what we see that next morning, that first Easter morning, in the early morning hours, as women were going to the tomb to prepare Jesus' body for burial, we read in Matthew 28 that Jesus was not there, that he had risen from the dead, that he had in fact conquered sin and death. He had been vindicated, and because he is able to grant to you and to me forgiveness of sins and righteousness so that we can be made right with God. We see that amazing and beautiful resurrection story that our Christian faith rises and falls upon. And so, friends, that is the story of Jesus' final week before that first glorious Easter. And it is my hope and prayer that this will help you to better prepare your heart for the resurrection of our Redeemer. Until next time, God bless.